The relentless downpour had turned Blackwood Forest into a soaked, muddy mess, but that hadn't deterred the group of friends from their long-awaited camping trip. The forest was a place of natural beauty, thick with ancient trees and a canopy that seemed to blot out the sky even on the brightest days. On this particular night, however, the storm made the forest feel claustrophobic and unnervingly dark. Emma, Jake, Lisa, and Mark had been friends since college, and this trip was meant to be a reunion of sorts. They had planned it for months, eagerly anticipating a weekend away from the hustle and bustle of city life. They set up their tents in a small clearing and gathered around a makeshift campfire, the flames struggling against the damp air. "I told you guys we should have checked the weather forecast," Lisa said, pulling her rain jacket tighter around her. "Oh, come on, Lisa," Jake replied with a grin. "What's a camping trip without a little adventure?" Emma rolled her eyes but smiled. "Adventure is one thing, Jake. This is more like survival." Mark, ever the optimist, added more wood to the fire. "We'll be fine. We've got plenty of supplies, and it's just rain. We're tough, right?" Despite their bravado, the atmosphere around the campfire was tense. The rain pounded on the canopy above, creating a cacophony of sound that drowned out any attempts at conversation. Every so often, a gust of wind would send a shiver through the group as it rattled the trees and sent leaves fluttering to the ground. As the evening wore on, the friends tried to make the best of it. They shared stories, roasted marshmallows, and laughed about old times. But beneath their laughter, there was an undercurrent of unease. The forest seemed alive, its shadows shifting and dancing in the firelight. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made them jump, their eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "Did you guys hear that?" Emma suddenly asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Hear what?" Mark asked, glancing around nervously. "I thought I heard something," she said, peering into the trees. "Like footsteps." "It's probably just an animal," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa, who had been silent for a while, looked genuinely frightened. "I don't know, guys. This place gives me the creeps. Maybe we should head back to the car." Jake shook his head. "We're miles from the car, and in this weather, we'd never make it. Let's just stay put and keep the fire going. We'll be safe here." They tried to resume their conversation, but the mood had shifted. The forest felt more oppressive, the darkness around them more impenetrable. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her heart racing with every noise. A sudden, loud crack echoed through the forest, louder than any of the previous sounds. The friends froze, their eyes wide with fear. Mark grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam of light seemed feeble against the night. "What was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Mark replied, his hand shaking slightly as he held the flashlight. "But it sounded close." Jake stood up, trying to project confidence. "Stay here. I'll go check it out." "No way!" Emma grabbed his arm. "You're not going out there alone." Jake hesitated, then nodded. "All right, we'll all go. Stay close and keep your eyes open." They doused the fire, not wanting to attract any unwanted attention, and ventured into the forest. The rain had lessened, but the ground was treacherous and the thick canopy overhead blocked out any moonlight that might have seeped through the clouds. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing only glimpses of trees and underbrush. They moved slowly, every sound amplified by the silence that surrounded them. The forest felt like a living entity, its presence overwhelming. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, and she could see the fear reflected in her friend's eyes. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the source of the noise. A large tree had fallen, its massive trunk blocking their path. The sight of it was both a relief and a disappointment. It was just a tree, nothing more. "See? Nothing to worry about," Jake said, though his voice was shaky. They turned to head back to camp when a low, guttural growl froze them in their tracks. The sound was unmistakable, and it was close. Too close. They spun around, flashlights darting in every direction, but saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" Lisa whispered, clutching Mark's arm. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely audible. "We need to get back to camp. Now." They moved quickly, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The growling continued, growing louder and more menacing. Panic set in, and they broke into a run, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they navigated the uneven terrain. Emma stumbled and fell, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and landing in the mud. She scrambled to her feet, but the darkness was disorienting. She could hear her friends shouting her name, but their voices seemed distant, muffled by the rain and the pounding of her own heart. She picked up the flashlight, its beam flickering, and tried to find her way back to the others. The growling was louder now, almost deafening, and she could feel hot breath on the back of her neck. She turned, the flashlight illuminating a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her from the darkness. She screamed, dropping the flashlight again, and running blindly through the forest. Branches tore at her clothes and scratched her skin, but she didn't stop. She could hear the creature behind her, its heavy footsteps and guttural growls spurring her on. She burst into the clearing where their camp had been, but it was empty. The tents were gone, the fire extinguished. Panic gripped her as she realized she was alone. She looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her friends. "Jake, Mark, Lisa!" she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the night. The growling was closer now, and she could feel the ground shake with each step the creature took. She turned and saw it emerging from the trees, a massive, shadowy figure with glowing eyes and sharp, jagged teeth. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a nightmare come to life. With no other options, she ran again, her mind a blur of fear and desperation. She stumbled through the forest, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to get away. The creature was relentless, its growls echoing in her ears, its eyes burning into her soul. Emma didn't know how long she ran, but eventually, she saw a faint light in the distance. It was the car. She had somehow found her way back to the trailhead. She pushed herself harder, her legs burning with exhaustion, and finally reached the vehicle. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and managed to unlock the door. She threw herself inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The creature's growl was right outside, and she could see its eyes peering at her through the window. She started the car, her hands trembling so much that she could barely turn the key. The engine roared to life, and she floored the gas pedal, speeding down the narrow forest road. She didn't look back, afraid of what she might see. After what felt like an eternity, she burst out of the forest and onto the main road. She drove blindly, her mind still reeling from the terror she had just experienced. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town, pulling into a gas station and collapsing in a fit of sobs. The police were called, and Emma told them everything. They searched Blackwood Forest, but there was no sign of Jake, Mark, or Lisa. The camp was undisturbed, the tent still in place. The only evidence of the creature was the deep, claw-like gouges in the trees and the ground. Emma was never the same after that night. The forest had taken something from her, something she could never get back. She moved away from the city, unable to bear the memories of her lost friends. The nightmares never stopped, though, and she could still hear the growling in the darkness. Blackwood Forest became infamous, the legend of the creature spreading like wildfire. People avoided it, but the stories persisted. Some said it was an ancient guardian of the forest, angered by the intrusion of humans. Others believed it was a manifestation of the forest's own darkness, feeding on the fear of those who dared to enter. Years later, a group of teenagers, intrigued by the legend of Blackwood Forest, decided to venture into its depths. They were skeptics, convinced that the stories were just that, stories meant to scare children and keep people away from the forest. Armed with flashlights, tents, and an adventurous spirit, they set off, determined to spend the night and debunk the myths once and for all. The weather was eerily similar to that fateful night years ago. The rain started as a light drizzle but soon turned into a torrential downpour. The forest seemed to come alive with the storm, the trees swaying and creaking ominously. The teenagers set up their camp in the same clearing where Emma and her friends had once camped. As night fell, they gathered around a small fire, the flames flickering weakly against the wet wood. They laughed and told ghost stories, their voices filled with bravado. But as the night wore on, the same uneasy feeling settled over them. The forest seemed to watch them, its shadows shifting and moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. One of the boys, Alex, decided to explore the forest, convinced that he could find something to prove that the stories were just myths. His friends tried to dissuade him, but he was determined. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of adventure, he ventured into the trees. Minutes turned into hours, and Alex didn't return. His friends grew worried, their earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. They called out his name, their voices echoing through the forest, but there was no response. The growling started soon after, low and menacing, coming from all directions. Panic set in, and they abandoned their camp, running blindly through the forest, just as Emma had done years before. The growling grew louder, the eyes glowing in the darkness more numerous. The teenagers were picked off one by one, their screams echoing through the night. In the morning, the forest was silent once more. The rain had stopped, and the sun shone weakly through the canopy. The clearing was empty save for the remnants of the campfire and the deep, claw-like gouges in the trees and the ground. Blackwood Forest had claimed more souls, its darkness spreading like a contagion. The legend grew, and the warnings became more dire. No one entered the forest willingly anymore, but the stories continued, passed down from generation to generation. The forest waited, its hunger insatiable, its shadows ever watchful. For those who dared to enter, there was no escape. The creature, the embodiment of the forest's darkest fears, would be there, its eyes glowing in the darkness, ready to claim the next unsuspecting souls who ventured into its depths.